Good afternoon, everyone. For sake of staying on schedule this afternoon, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Keith Ritchie. I'm the Assistant Director of Outreach for KHEAA, Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority. We're the folks behind KEYS Money, the Work Ready Scholarship, Dual Credit Scholarship, you name it. If it has to do with helping folks afford college or technical school, we're all about it. So today, what we're going to be talking about is the 24-25 version of the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid, which is essentially your money application. I'm sure a lot of you all are aware, have heard some of the rumors, and they are true. The FAFSA is totally changing. Very, very different stuff coming in with this new cycle. I will say this, if you're like me and you know, it'll take some getting used to all the changes and might make you a little uneasy feeling all these drastic changes that are coming down the pike. Here's what helps me sleep at night before we jump into the details. With these changes on the FAFSA, they're really meant to make the FAFSA quicker, easier, more automated than ever before. And the icing on the cake is more people than ever before are expected to be eligible for more money. So all of those are positive things. I'll be totally transparent with everyone on this call today. You know, there are some changes that I think will be tough, and there will be some obstacles that we'll have to kind of put our heads together and get creative about when it comes to, you know, how to handle certain situations on this new FAFSA. But again, that's what gives me solace with all the changes, is that it is meant to make it quicker, easier, more automated than before. If y'all don't mind, go ahead and mute yourselves, and we'll go ahead and get this show on the road today. I will say this also, if I say anything that doesn't make sense, I like to keep things super informal. So please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go along, and I'll try to kind of check on that every so often, and I'll try to address any questions that come by. The other thing I just want to let everyone know about, just as another disclaimer, take everything that we say with a grain of salt, because things are changing. We receive updates on like a daily basis at this point as we get closer and closer to the FAFSA actually opening. So just know that what we talk about today is the latest that we know at KHEAA, but that could certainly change between now and when the FAFSA opens. Just seeing some of the familiar faces on this call today and some of the names that I recognize. I know some of you all have probably seen one of our FAFSA trainings already earlier in the fall. And I will say this, that there are things that we've talked about earlier in the fall that no longer apply, that have changed since then. So I'm glad that some of you all were able to hear this a second or third time, because we have done our best to tweak our presentation as the updates come in. So without further ado, I know we've got a few more people coming in from the waiting room. We're going to go ahead and get started with what I wanted to go ahead and do, just to kind of get our blood flowing a little bit and get our thoughts together before we jump into the details of the FAFSA. I figured let's do a quick, fun Kahoot game. So what I'm going to do, let me share my screen real quick. All right, so if you'd like to play along for our Kahoot, it's just going to be a little bit of a FAFSA-based quiz to get our thoughts flowing this afternoon. Go ahead and pull out your phone and go to kahoot.it, kahoot.it, and when you go on there, you'll type in this game pin 2092864, and you'll be able to join our game. I wish I could tell you we have fabulous prizes beyond your wildest imaginations, but we're just playing for bragging rights this afternoon. But go ahead and join us on kahoot.it if you would like to follow along. When you get onto kahoot.it, you'll go ahead and put in that 2092864 number, and that'll get you linked up with our Kahoot game. So I'll give you all a moment to get settled into that. For those of you getting in from the waiting room, my name is Keith Ritchie. I'm the Assistant Director of Outreach for KHEAA. Today's topic will be the changes coming down the pike for the 24-25 free application for federal student aid. As I just mentioned, before we get into the details of what changes are coming down the pike, we figured it'd be fun to go ahead and do a quick Kahoot game. So if you would like to join us, all you need to do is go to kahoot.it and type in the game pin at the top of the screen there, 2092864, and that'll link you up. If you're unable to join officially, no worries. You can certainly follow along to the questions, and we'll talk about that. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll get this show started. All right, so for those of you who have never played Kahoot before, the quicker you answer your questions, the more points that you will receive. The FAFSA Simplification Act is intended to reduce the number of questions on the form, make adding tax information more seamless, create more eligibility for more people, or all of the above. All of the above. Very good. Wendy jumps out to an early lead. Good job, Wendy, Ashley, and Morgan. All right, here we go. Second question. The SAI will replace the EFC. What does that SAI stand for? Is it School Access Information, Student Aid Index, Student Aid Information, or the Scholarship Aid Index? What does SAI stand for? You'll hear us talk a lot about that today. Very good. Student Aid Index. That replaces the old expected family contribution. Kind of similar in that it will be the code that the FAFSA spits out, and it'll help us determine eligibility for certain aid programs. But we'll talk a lot more detail about that in a few minutes. Way to go, Ashley, taking the lead. All right. Next question. SAI values will range from 0 to 999,999. Is that true or false? SAI values will range from 0 to roughly $1 million. That is false. That is false. I will say, just to clarify, when it comes to the SAI range, and we'll talk a lot more detail about this in a little bit, it's really that front end, the lower end of that. It actually can have a negative value. And we'll talk a lot about that here in a few minutes. And that's a major change that we're not used to in the world of the FAFSA. All right, Wendy. Here we go. Question 4. Non-tax filers will have what SAI? So a family who does not file taxes will have what SAI? Is it negative 1,500, negative 500, 0, or 500? What will that SAI be for a non-tax filer? Very good. Negative 1,500. So going back to that last question, the lowest SAI that a student could have is negative 1,500. We'll talk in terms of what that would mean for the student here in just a few minutes. Way to go, Morgan and Marianne and Christina. Great job. All right, next question, number 5. Minimum and maximum Pell will be based on SAI only, federal poverty charts only, SAI or federal poverty chart, whichever is more favorable for the student, or AGI and SAI averaged together. Minimum and maximum Pell will be based on what? Very good. SAI or the federal poverty charts from 2022, whichever is most favorable for the student. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail here in just a few. Marianne is now in the lead. Nice job, Marianne. All right, question number 6. It is estimated that the FAFSA changes will increase Pell recipients by 1,500 fewer, 500,000 more, 5,000 more, or 5 million more. How many more Pell recipients are estimated to be out there with this new FAFSA? 500,000. Think about that. 500,000 more people are expected to be eligible for a Pell Grant with these changes coming down the pike to the FAFSA. So again, as I mentioned earlier, change is difficult. It'll take us some getting used to, but that is certainly something that helps me sleep at night, knowing that more folks are going to be eligible for more money to help pay for college. So that's all a good thing. All right, way to go, Jordan and Jen, now in first and second place, respectively. All right, here we go. Question 7, another true or false coming at you. The number of students a family has in college will no longer factor into the SAI calculation. Is that true or false? Number of students a family has in college. will no longer factor into the SAI calculation. True or false? That is true. That is true. So that is certainly one of the that's certainly one of the changes that could potentially be troublesome for quite a few families. But there is some silver lining. There is a silver lining to that we'll get into when we talk about some of the logistics of how to best mentor students that we meet. All right, way to go. Jen is now in the lead. All right, question number 8, another true or false coming. You will now need to report farms and businesses as assets on the FAFSA, regardless of the number of employees. That is true. It's another change that's going to be a little tricky to contend with, but again, we'll talk through all the details of that today. All right, Jen, Wendy, and Mary Ann in first, second, and third. Question number 9, another true or false. Both parents will more than likely need an FSA ID for the 24-25 FAFSA. True or false? Both parents will more than likely need an FSA ID for the 24-25 FAFSA. That is true. That is true. There are several different scenarios that we'll talk about today that would require both parents now to have an FSA ID. So that's certainly a big change compared to what we've had before. All right, Wendy is now back in the lead. Question 10, another true or false. There will be changes made to the dependency questions. True or false? Will there be changes made to the dependency questions? That is false. So with all the changes come down to the pike, one section that actually will be pretty much unchanged will be the dependency question. I will say this, they are changing the name of it. No longer are they going to refer to it as the dependency section. Now they're going to call it student personal circumstances. But the questions themselves will actually be the same. The same things that used to make you an independent student on the FAFSA will still make you an independent student moving forward with this new version. All right, let's see. Wendy, Marianne, and Christina holding on strong. Last question. Here we go. Who can you always look to for assistance with the FAFSA and FAFSA changes? Is it KHEAA, KHSAA, KHEAA, the car company, or no one? I'm all alone in this. Of course, KHEAA. Just to let everyone know, remember we have a team of outreach counselors no matter where you're standing, anywhere in the state. You are represented by at least one KHEAA outreach counselor. And they've all been trained extensively on the new FAFSA and are more than willing and able to help with FAFSA creation, or I'm sorry, FSA ID creation, FAFSA workshops, parent nights. We have a plethora of presentations available as well. So please, if you don't know who your KHEAA outreach counselor is, certainly ask me at some point before hopping off here and I'll get you connected to the right person. All right, very good. Let's see who ended up coming out on top. In third place, we have Laura. Congratulations, Laura. Very good. In second place, Mary Ann. Great job, Mary Ann. And last but not least, in first place, 8,491 points, Wendy. But way to go, Wendy. All right. As I mentioned, I wish we had fabulous prizes beyond your wildest imaginations, but we all know Wendy can walk away here with bragging rights coming in first place. All right. Very good. I just wanted to kind of start off with the quick Kahoot just to get our thoughts flowing a little bit and buy us a little bit of time for folks to get in from the waiting room. But now I'm going to go ahead and pull up my presentation and we'll get started. Again, for those of you who are just now getting settled in, my name's Keith Ritchie. I'm the Assistant Director of Outreach for KHEAA, Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority. Today, we're going to be talking about the 24-25 FAFSA changes that are coming down the pike. Remember, as I said a few minutes ago, take these with a grain of salt. Some of this could still change between now and when the FAFSA actually opens in December. So without further ado, let me pull up my slides and we'll get started. If you have any questions at any point, if there's something that I say that doesn't make sense, feel free to either unmute and stop me and we can talk about it, or you can go ahead and plug it into the chat and I'll do my best to keep an eye on the chat box periodically every few minutes. All right, bear with me as I pull up my slides. Okay. Can you all see my slides? Can someone give me a thumbs up or say something in the chat just to make sure that you all can see that? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. All right. So as we mentioned a few minutes ago, the easiest way that I could really kind of decipher through all the changes is to really come up with a top 10 list of changes. So this is how we're going to organize our conversation. The timeline is going to be different this year, which we'll get into. The terminology is going to be very different moving forward in the financial aid world. So it's going to feel like we're learning a new language. So we're going to talk about some of the terminology changes coming down the pike. A lot of changes when it has to do with the FSA ID, which is just a fancy way of saying username and password for the FAFSA. We'll talk about some of those changes that'll impact your students and families. We're going to talk a lot about consent. You'll hear that word a lot in the financial aid circles over the next few months. What they're referring to is consent for tax information to be pulled from the IRS onto the FAFSA. We'll talk a lot about how important that is and what can happen through that process. We're going to talk a lot about parent information that has changed in terms of which parent we go with and what could be needed from your parents in order to get a FAFSA to the finish line. As we mentioned in the KHEAA game a little bit ago, the EFC, otherwise known as the expected family contribution, is being replaced with the SAI, which is the student aid index. But essentially, it is similar in that it is a code that the FAFSA will spit out to help us determine eligibility for certain aid programs, but it works a lot differently than the actual old EFC. So we'll talk a little bit about how that calculation is a little bit different. We're going to talk a lot about assets and what now has to be reported as an asset on the FAFSA. We're going to talk about eligibility, the process, and calculation. As I mentioned at the beginning, for those of you who didn't hear it, I'm going to say it one more time, but with all the changes that are coming down the pike, it is important to note that first off, they're trying to make this FAFSA quicker, easier, and more automated than ever before. And the icing on the cake is that more people will now be eligible for more money. In fact, to give you all an idea, in a normal year, 35 to 40% of all FAFSA filers are typically eligible for a Pell Grant. They are now projecting that 2/3, 66% of all FAFSA filers will be eligible for a Pell Grant moving forward. That's crazy to me. That's a huge, huge bump up. I mean, that's like nothing we've ever seen before in terms of a change in the financial aid world. So more people than ever before will be eligible for Pell Grants and other types of aid. So that's what kind of keeps me, excited about some of the changes that are coming down the pike. But again, we'll talk about all of it today that we're aware of at KHEAA, the good, the bad, and the ugly. All right, so let's jump right into the timeline. There's going to be a one-time delay due to all these changes. So, usually if you see us presenting about the FAFSA at KHEAA, you usually hear us talk about October 1st, and we preach about how important it is to get that FAFSA done early in the fall, like in October or November. But because they're making so many changes to the calculation, the website's different, the form's different, everything is changing on that FAFSA. It's actually not going to open up this year until December. Here's the tricky thing, guys. We still don't have a date yet. We still don't know exactly when in December this thing's going to open up. We just know that it is supposed to open up at some point in the month of December. If I was a betting man, here's what I'm going to tell you. This is not like an official KHEAA stance or anything like that, but my opinion is I would not hold out a whole lot of hope for this thing opening up early in December. I have a feeling it's going to be in the back half of December. I'd be shocked if it's not open or if it's, opens up before Christmas break. So I have a feeling that this is going to be at some point when schools are shut down, almost like a soft grand opening, so to speak. So just keep that in mind, that this is only going to be a one-year change, this idea of opening up in December. Once we get past this year of transition, it is projected to go back to October 1st, like how it's been for several years. Here's our 2 cents about this from a logistical standpoint. Let's say this thing opens up at some point when schools are out on Christmas break. The problem with that is students and families aren't going to have as much support available to them. A lot of our outreach counselors are going to be off work, spending time with their families over the Christmas break. A lot of schools are going to be shut down. College campuses are going to be shut down as well in a lot of cases. So our advice to everyone in here who schedules FAFSA workshops is to wait until January to actually have your FAFSA workshops in your schools and your communities. Because here's the thing, even if this thing opens up earlier than what I expect in the month of December, before schools all shut down, I don't know if you all have ever helped someone through a FAFSA on the first day or two that it opens, but it can be a nightmare in terms of just tech glitches and connectability issues and things like that. Sometimes it can take a long time to get through the finish line of a FAFSA when it first opens up. So the way I look at it, let's let other states test out and work out all the kinks to this new FAFSA form. Let's give it a couple weeks and come back in January when outreach counselors are available, financial aid counselors are standing by, high school counselors are available in the buildings. I think that it'll be a lot more of a smooth process for your families if we really set our sights on promoting January as our big FAFSA month in Kentucky. So along those lines, KHEAA is creating a little bit of a social media push over the next couple months called the Wait Till One campaign. We do have a social media toolkit available for college access professionals on KHEAAgoestocollege.com. So I encourage you all to check that out if you want to help us spread the word about some of these FAFSA changes, and in particular, waiting until January to complete the FAFSA. That's certainly going to be something that we're pushing throughout the state. Okay, so a couple questions have come in on the chat. One question involves parent information. We'll get to that in just a couple minutes. And then I'll thank you, Wendy, for answering some of that for us. But we'll certainly come back to that here in just a couple minutes. Okay, very good. All right, so let's switch gears to terminology changes that are coming down the pike. First off, one of the things you'll hear a lot about is this idea of a FAFSA experience. That's now the preferred term. Instead of filling out a FAFSA or completing a FAFSA, you'll hear federal student aid refer to it as participating in the FAFSA experience. Doesn't that sound a lot more fun? I'll probably be the last person on earth to use that terminology, but just FYI, so everyone's aware of it, that's what they're talking about. When you hear the FAFSA experience, it's just simply filling out the FAFSA. Award letter is going away. So that's that thing that the colleges send out that shows line by line how much it costs to go there for a year and every single piece of aid that they're being offered. So it also shows, the tuition and room and board and all that kind of stuff. Well, anyway, they've polled a lot of students throughout the country, and they have found that a lot of students are not familiar with letter. So they're getting rid of the idea of using it as an award letter, and now they're replacing it with what they call an aid offer or aid notification. But it's the same thing as the old award letter. Along those same lines, room and board is no more. So when you get these aid offers, you won't see room and board anymore. It's being replaced with food and housing. Again, I think they're just trying to be a little bit more straightforward with what they're referring to with some of the terminology. So food and housing replaces room and board. As I mentioned in the Kahoot game, the EFC, the expected family contribution, is no more. It is now being replaced with the student aid index as the code that the FAFSA will spit out to help us determine eligibility for certain aid programs. We'll talk a lot more detail about the SAI here in a few slides. Students and parents are now going to be referred to as a contributor on the FAFSA. Here is something that I think is worth noting today. I think that that's a little problematic, that word contributor, because I think a lot of folks are going to get confused by that. When a lot of times, when someone hears the word contributor, they think of like financial connotations to that. Just so everyone's clear about this and that we're all on the same page, what they mean as contributor is simply someone who is contributing their information on the FAFSA. So that'll be the student themselves, and if it's a dependent student, it would be their parent or parents that would be contributing that information. So it has nothing to do with contributing financially. It has nothing to do with signing up to pay for something or to pay for a college bill or anything like that. Simply when they see that word contributor, it means that they're contributing their information on a student's FAFSA. So that's something that we can certainly get out in front of and help educate the general public about what that terminology means. On the FAFSA, you'll see a difference also, that no longer are they calling it parent one versus parent two. I guess you don't have to rank which parent you love more on the FAFSA now. It's going to be parent and other parent. So anytime you see that terminology, that's what they're referring to, would be parent and other parent that would be listed on the FAFSA. And then finally, household size is now going to be considered family size. Some other terminology changes that can be a little convoluted, but I think it would be important for us to differentiate right now. Situations that potentially lead to a dependency override appeal are now going to be referred to as unusual circumstances. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say a student lives with grandparent or aunt or uncle or anyone that's not a biological parent, but it turns out that it wasn't like a legal guardianship. The student wasn't ever in foster care. Basically, none of the situations that would have made them automatically independent apply to their situation. So the FAFSA will say, okay, based on how you're answering these questions, you're considered a dependent student and would need to provide biological parent information. And then it's going to ask, are you able to provide that information? And if a student is unable to reach their parents for whatever reason, maybe it's an unsafe situation or maybe their whereabouts are unknown, this would lead to what we call a dependency override appeal, where the student would write a letter typically and provide documentation to the financial aid office of the college and let them know about their situation. And the college can review that and potentially decide to make that student become independent for financial aid purposes. So again, if you ever see the terminology unusual circumstances, a light bulb should turn on in your head that says, okay, think dependency override appeal. So you'll see that quite a bit over the fall and winter. If you see unusual circumstance, think dependency override. The other type of appeal that you might run into are special circumstances. Okay, so this would be a situation that potentially leads to a professional judgment that would be based on finances, typically. So I'll give you an example. Let's say mom made $60,000 in 2022, but has since lost her job. Because that's not going to show up on that old 2022 tax record, this would be an example of an appeal that a family may choose to file with the financial aid office at the college to potentially get a recalculation of aid eligibility. So that's going to be considered special circumstance. So special circumstance would be something that has to do with a professional judgment appeal based on finances. Unusual circumstance is an appeal that leads to a dependency override. So those are just a little bit of a change in terminology when it comes to that process. Simplified needs assessment is now going to be referred to as applicant exempt from asset reporting. This isn't going to be something you really have to worry about on the front end, just so you're aware of it. Again, it has to do with the general theme of trying to be a little bit more direct on what they are referring to with their terminology. So this would be anyone who does not have to worry about answering asset questions on their FAFSA. The IRS data retrieval tool has gone away. So here's the thing about the IRS retrieval tool. It was a great thing when it worked. And the problem is it didn't always work. And it was still very manual in that, you know, a student or a parent had to fill out a form. Everything had to match. It was really finicky if it didn't match. And sometimes there'd be no rhyme or reason. It just didn't work and couldn't really figure out why. Well, that's going away. And I think this is a great, great change coming down the pike. It's being replaced with what they call the direct data exchange. Essentially, what this is instead of filling out this form to transfer IRS information over to the FAFSA, what the direct data exchange is, it's going to have the IRS basically do that automatically with no form to be filled out. So the way it would work is when you log on to the FAFSA, one of the first things you'll be hit with is this idea of consent. Do you consent to allow the IRS and federal student aid to get on the same page and retrieve that tax information from 2022? When they say yes, the IRS and federal student aid come together behind the scenes and they get that information for you. So it's a lot more of a quick, easy, direct, automated process to get that tax information pulled over from the IRS. So I love that particular change. Dependency questions, as I mentioned in the Kahoot game, are now going to be referred to as student personal circumstances. And then finally, at the end, when you submit a FAFSA, no longer are you going to see the old student aid report or the SAR, a lot of people refer to it as. It's being replaced with what they call the FAFSA submission summary. And this is also a pretty positive change, in my opinion, in that, you know, the old student aid report was nice, but it was a very static summary page. You know, it just kind of showed how the FAFSA was left off, essentially. But moving forward with this FAFSA submission summary, our understanding is that this is going to be like a living, breathing hub of updates. So instead of just checking in at the one time for confirmation that the FAFSA went through, they'll be able to log into this resource hub and be able to see updates about their colleges that they put on the FAFSA. They'll be able to see if they've been selected for verification. They'll be able to kind of see what the latest is with their other contributors that they're waiting to maybe complete their portion of the FAFSA. So this is going to be like a go-to stopping place to be able to see what the latest is when it comes to your financial aid and specifically your FAFSA. So again, that replaces the old static student aid report. Okay. When we're talking about the FSAID changes coming down the pike, I'm sure a lot of you all remember a couple years back, they started this multi-factor authentication stuff, where basically when you set up these FSAIDs, you would be given like a 6-digit code. It would be text to your phone, and you'd also get one emailed to you. That's not going away. Not only is the FAFSA trying to become easier and quicker, more automated, it's also trying to be more secure and private with information. So one of the things that's super important to remember is that now email addresses are required in order to set up an FSAID. It used to be optional and recommended, but now an email address is 100% required in order to set up an FSAID. And again, those codes would come along to verify that email address. We cannot stress enough the importance of an authentication app and setting that up when you create your FSAID. We were recently at, we attended a webinar just in the last week or so from Federal Student Aid that talked about FSAID and creation for folks. When you create this, it gives you the option to set up an authentication app that would just be another ace up your sleeve if you ever lose that password. I got to tell you all, it takes about 45 more seconds to do it. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to encourage folks to use an authentication app. It will make their life a lot easier if they ever lose that password with an FSAID. But essentially, it gives them a code that is constantly changing. All they got to do is go to their app store on their phone, download. It doesn't matter which authentication app. You can use Google or Microsoft. There's a million of them out there. But then all they got to do, there's a QR code on the FSAID side. They snap that, it gets all connected, and then they'll be able to use that as another way to retrieve their password should they get locked out at any point. So just want to throw that out there for anyone who helps students and families through the FSAID creation process. Another thing that's a pretty big change to the FAFSA is you're going to want to make sure that FSAIDs are set up in advance of the FAFSA. Before, it didn't matter so much if they did that before or after or during the process. But now we strongly recommend that everyone creates an FSAID in advance of the actual FAFSA itself. Here's the thing about that. When you create that FSAID for the first time, it goes through a verification process through Social Security Administration to verify you are who you are. That typically takes 3 to 5 days on average, but the feds have warned us that there could be backlogs and things that could play into the factor here, where it could take up to 2 weeks in order for that verification to come back. But this is absolutely required in order to grant consent to the IRS to be able to pull that tax information over. So here's what happens. If you don't set up that FSAID in advance, you can technically go onto the FAFSA, but you're not going to be able to provide that consent to get that tax information pulled over. So there's not going to be much you can do with that FAFSA until you actually have a verified FSAID. So our recommendation at KHEAA is to go ahead and set that up now. Logistically speaking, what a lot of our outreach counselors are doing is they're scheduling FSAID workshops. So my 2 cents of this is this: instead of thinking of the FSAID and the FAFSA tied together, what I would do if I were you is look at potentially hosting an FSAID workshop like around this time of year, and then we'll come back in January and do a FAFSA workshop. And the thought is, if we can get these FSAIDs put to bed and verified, it'll be one less thing that we'll have to kind of work through on the day or the night of your FAFSA workshop. So it'll make things go a lot more smooth for all of your families if you can encourage them to do that ahead of time. And then it'll just be simply using that FSAID, jumping into the FAFSA, and they'll be able to rock and roll right through it. Another major change when it comes to the FSAIDs has to do with undocumented parents. Undocumented parents will now also need an FSAID. And this is the first time that this has ever been a requirement. In fact, you used to have a Social Security number in order to set up an FSAID. But starting with this new FAFSA cycle for the 24-25 cycle, that's no longer the case. Undocumented parents will also need to create one. You may be wondering, well, how do you do that without a social? That webinar that I was referring to from Federal Student Aid last week showed prototype of what this is going to look like when it does go live. But essentially, when they go onto the FSAID website, and in the box where you would put a social security number, underneath that, there's a box you can check that says, I do not have a social. You click on that, and that's what will prompt an undocumented parent to go through an identity verification process. So the way they're doing this is Federal Student Aid is partnering with TransUnion to do this verification process. So like TransUnion, like the credit agency. And the best way I can describe it, it's like one of those forms. You all ever like seen those forms online where it'll be like, our records indicate that you bought a car in 2019. What was the make and model of that car? Or our records show you had this particular address. Which one of these would be correct? So anyway, this would be a way for an undocumented parent to verify their identity potentially without a social security number. Here's the problem. There could be a situation where that doesn't work. If that doesn't work, then what they can do is actually call Federal Student Aid and do a manual verification process through them. That would entail them to send in things like a driver's license or a utility bill or a municipal ID. There's a laundry list of things that they'd be able to fill out and send in to verify that identity. But they did tell us that most folks should be able to use that identity verification process through TransUnion, even if they don't have a credit history. So that is something that is a new update that we just learned in the last week. So just wanted to throw that out there to everyone. But again, undocumented parents will need an FSA ID in order to access the online FAFSA. Another major change coming down the pike when it comes to FSA IDs is this. There are going to be a lot of situations where both parents in a family will actually need their own separate, unique FSA ID. So here are those situations that would require this. If parents are married and they file separate tax forms, both parents would theoretically need their own separate FSA ID. If their marital status does not match the tax filing status, both would need an FSA ID. If biological parents live together, but they're unmarried, both would need an FSA ID, or if one fails to give consent. So these are situations where both parents would need their own separate accounts in order to access the FAFSA. Here's the best way I can wrap my head around this. Think about it in terms of this. When you're working with a family, how many tax records are we going to need to pull from? You're always going to need the student to have an FSA ID. That's a given. Whether they file taxes or not, we're still pulling that tax record information from the IRS. If they never filed taxes before, that's what they're pulling. The IRS is saying our records show that you don't have a tax record, and that's fine. But just know that the student's always going to need an FSA ID. And then when you're trying to figure out how many of the parents do we need one, is it just one parent or both? How many tax records are you pulling from? So if parents are married and they file jointly, they're all meshed together on one tax form. Therefore, they only need one FSA ID because they're only looking at that one tax record because they filed jointly. All these other situations, though, if you think about it, they all have their own separate tax record. Therefore, they're going to need to basically provide their own separate, unique consent, and they're going to have to get that IRS tax record pulled for them specifically because they are on separate tax records. So that's how that works. Great question in the chat box. We're going to get to divorce situations and situations where parents are remarried or separated here on the next slide. So we'll get to that here in just a second. Before we get to that and answer those questions, though, one thing that I do want to make very clear, as we help parents set up these FSA IDs, again, there are so many situations where both parents are going to need one. Here's my opinion or my advice on there in terms of messaging. If it were me, I would keep it simple. And what I mean by that is instead of sitting there and explaining how many tax records and all that stuff, this is what I would say. I would encourage everyone on this call, when you're meeting with students and families, I would just encourage them to all set up their own FSA ID. It doesn't hurt anything if they set up an FSA ID and don't end up ever needing it. But here's my thought on this. I would much rather have both parents have an FSA ID and it turns out we only needed one of them than to wish we had both of them and we only have one. You get what I'm saying? When they come in January to do their FAFSA workshop at the high school or at the college campus. So if it were me, from a messaging standpoint, I would do everything in my power to try to encourage everyone, students and parents, to go ahead and set up their FSA ID. But remember, in order to do that, they'll need their own separate, unique they would need their own separate, unique email address and information in order to do that. One thing that is very challenging with this, and it's worth noting, if any contributor on a FAFSA, meaning anyone who's providing information on their FAFSA, is unable to successfully set up an FSA ID, every contributor in that family will have to file a paper FAFSA. So we used to have an ace up our sleeve, guys, with the FAFSA, in that we always had that signature page on the online form that if all else fails, we could have just printed off, signed it, threw it in the mail, went to London, Kentucky, so it wasn't that big of a deal. We don't have that luxury anymore moving forward. Now, if anyone, mom or dad or student, anyone who's unable to provide an FSA ID, everyone in that family will now have to basically fill out a FAFSA like it's 1995 and go the paper route. And the problem with that is they estimate on average that would take about 8 weeks to process versus 3 to 5 business days if we can get the online form to work. So my advice to everyone on this call, if you run into this situation, someone's having a hard time getting their FSA ID established, I would do everything in my power to avoid going that paper route. I'd be calling the 1-800 number, fighting with customer service for 45 minutes if we have to. I'd be calling my KHEAA outreach counselor, see if they can get creative and put their heads together with you and see if we can figure out why that FSA ID is not working. But I would do everything in my power before I resorted to that paper FAFSA. But just know that's what we would resort to if we can't, at the end of the day, get that FSA ID established for each contributor. So when it comes to consent, as I mentioned, when you go on to the FAFSA, you're consenting to allow your tax information to be pulled from the IRS onto the FAFSA itself behind the scenes. You won't ever see the dollar amounts. You won't ever see like the tax form itself. It's just simply going to be pulled in and automatically encrypted on the FAFSA itself. But the only people who have to provide the consent is a contributor. Remember, a contributor is anyone who is basically contributing their information. If they file jointly, parents file jointly, because they're coming from that one tax form, would theoretically only have that one FSA ID, one of them can provide that consent and it works for both them and their spouse. But remember, if they file separate tax forms, or maybe they didn't file taxes at all, both are going to need their own separate FSA ID, and they're also going to have to provide that consent to get that information pulled from the IRS onto the FAFSA, okay? Now, in terms of the consent and this direct data exchange piece, undocumented parents are going to be able to use their I-10 number, which is a tax identification number from the IRS. They can use that on the FAFSA in order to help grant consent and use that direct data exchange to get that tax information over. So if an undocumented parent does have a tax ID, they would be able to use that in order to pull that information from the IRS. Here's the important part though, guys. If no consent is granted, you can technically still go on and move forward through the FAFSA. You can go through, you can fill out the whole thing. You can even hit submit, but here's the problem. No SAI will be calculated and no money can come from the colleges. So colleges are unable to disperse any financial aid without consent being granted. So the good news is if someone puts no to that consent question, the FAFSA is going to pop up with a big warning message right there in front of your face, and it'll keep flashing, and they'll have to really kind of fight to get through that in order to continue to say no. But theoretically, if they keep saying no to the consent, it will let them eventually move on, but no money is going to be granted if no consent is granted. So keep that in mind. Let's say a parent says no to that consent situation, and let's say 2 or 3 months go down the road and they get back on there and decide, well, maybe I should change that to yes. When they log back in with their FSA ID, my understanding is that it's actually going to be smart enough to know it'll have a message. It'll say, oh, our records show last time you were on here, you said no to consent. Is that why you're here today? So it'll give them the opportunity to toggle that to yes automatically without having to like search through the FAFSA form. Once they switch that to yes, all is forgiven and it should be good to go at that point. But just FYI, no consent means no money. The other major change to this FAFSA, guys, is that it's no longer this linear form. You know, the way I envision like the FAFSA workshops of the past, you know, it'd be like a family huddled around one computer. The students down on the computer, they're typing away. Then the kid gets up and the mom sits down and gets it to the finish line. Now it doesn't have to be that way because every contributor, the best way I can describe it is every contributor is just worried about their own portion of the FAFSA. So instead of this big, long, linear form, the new FAFSA is going to be like a series of miniature FAFSAs put together. You've got the student portion here and you've got the parent portion over here. They can do that together. They can do that separately. They can do it 20 miles apart. They can do it 2 weeks apart from one another. It doesn't matter who starts it or who finishes it. As long as each contributor who is required to be on that FAFSA gets their portion done, we're good to go, and it'll let them get to the finish line. All right, so going back to the questions in the chat about parent information, this is going to be one of the bigger changes that you'll see with the FAFSA moving forward. The old rule used to be in situations of divorce or separation. So if a kid in high school whose parents were divorced or separated, the old rule was you would go with the parent who you lived with the most over the last year. They changed this rule with this new cycle. So starting with the 24-25 FAFSA, it's now the parent who provided the most financial support over the last year. So whichever parent has provided the most financial support to you, that's whose information we're going with. Now, here's the thing about that. When we say financial support, that doesn't necessarily mean who made the most money. It doesn't even mean who claimed who on taxes, because to be honest, there are a lot of divorce agreements out there where parents kind of take turns claiming kids on their tax return. Like this parent will do it this year and the other one will do it next year. So it doesn't even matter who claims who on taxes. It's simply a judgment call for the family to figure out amongst themselves which parent actually provided the most financial support over the last year. I can tell you our role with that at KHEAA. When we're at a FAFSA workshop, what our outreach counselors are going to do is simple. We're going to take a back seat, because the way I look at it, the family, they're going to be the expert on their personal situation. We're just going to share the rule that you go with the parent who has provided the most financial support. Doesn't matter who you live with per se, but it's who have you actually received the most financial support from. That's whose information you go with. Okay, so keep that in mind. In terms of if it's a really close situation where it's close to 50-50, remember, if it's $1 more, then that's who the parent that we would go with would be. All right, so you may ask, if a family is struggling with trying to figure out which parent is the one to go with, you may want to ask some practical types of questions, like who pays for gas money, who pays for clothing, who pays for food on a daily basis. These are some of the things that can help a family get to that conclusion of which parent they may want to go with. Another thing that's going to be helpful for families, federal student aid is going to have what they call a parent wizard on the FAFSA that'll help them kind of come to that determination which person they should go with. Now, here's something that we learned at a conference a couple weeks back that pretty much about blew my mind. So if any of you have seen one of our earlier trainings in the fall, this is a new update that we were unaware of until just recently. So when determining which parent to use, all right, so we're talking about a divorce situation or a separation where parents do not live together, and you got to figure out, you're at that fork in the road. Do we go with biological mom's information or biological dad's information? When you're looking at that particular scenario, you're only comparing the financial support from the actual biological parent themselves. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say kids' parents are divorced, and let's say mom makes $0 a year. She doesn't work, but her spouse, she's remarried, step parent makes $250,000 a year. Let's say biological dad pays a little bit of child support to biological mother. As crazy as this may sound, when we're determining which parent to use now moving forward, this is not a household support question. It is simply an individual financial support question. Was it biological parent or was it biological mother or biological father who provided the most financial support for that student over the last year? So in that example where mom, let's say, has $0 of income, but is married to someone who makes $250,000 a year, versus dad who, let's say, paid a little bit of child support to the biological mother, as weird as it may sound, we would actually go with biological father in that particular scenario. So here's the best way I can describe this. When you are faced with a situation where parents are divorced or separated, the first fork in the road is which biological parent has provided the most financial support. Once you've determined which biological parent has provided the most financial support, then you have another series of questions that you need to go through. And the first one is, are you remarried? Because if so, that's when the step parent gets dragged into this situation as well. So let's just say similar example. Let's say kids' parents are divorced, right? And let's just say mom is who provided the most financial support and mom is remarried. Okay, so our first fork in the road, we determined mom is the biological parent who has provided the most financial support. Our next question is, mom, are you remarried as of today? And the answer is yes, she's married. Then all of a sudden, step parent does get pulled into the equation. And that step parent's income and demographic info would also be needed. And if those parents did not file jointly on a tax return, that step parent would also need their own separate FSA ID. Okay, so keep that in mind. So again, it's a two-tiered situation. If parents are divorced, which biological parent provided the most financial support? Once that's established, then you got to figure out, okay, is that parent now remarried to someone else? And if that's the case, that other person, that step parent, does get pulled into the FAFSA itself. All right, so just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. So the other thing that we need to be aware of when it comes to parent information, if a student is the one who is starting their FAFSA, they're going to be able to invite their parent as a contributor onto their FAFSA. So they'll get to this point where they're going to put in, like, let's say mom's demographic information. It'll be mom's name, social security number, date of birth, and email address. And then the student will hit a button that will invite mom to participate in the FAFSA experience as a contributor. Then theoretically, mom will receive an invite email from FAFSA that says, hey, little Johnny is needing you to help complete his FAFSA. Click here and you'll be able to enter. So the parent themselves will be able to get that invite email and jump into the FAFSA and complete their portion of it, and that'll help get to the finish line. Here's the issue, though. FAFSAs that are in this situation, they're going to be deleted after 45 days of no activity. So if little Johnny starts his FAFSA at their high school and gets to that point where they invite mom to do her portion, if nothing happens after 45 days, that FAFSA gets deleted. So FYI, I will say this, that's not actually a new rule. That's been the rule before. Here's the difference, though. They used to not really police it all that much. But we've been told several times in meetings with federal student aid and NCAN that that's going to be something they're going to be more strict about moving forward, about deleting records after 45 days of no activity. Doesn't mean the FSA IDs will be deleted or anything like that. So that's not as big of a deal. But just know, if you're helping a kid and all of a sudden a couple months go by and you know they started it, but you're not finding it anywhere, that may be what has happened. 45 days comes and goes, and with no activity or no progress, then that is going to be a situation where we're going to have to start from scratch. All right, so let me address a couple of the questions that have come in the chat box. Cindy asks, for divorced families, does only one parent do an FSA ID, but not the other who provides less financially? Yes, that is correct, Cindy. So when we're talking about that fork in the road of which parent that we're going with, mom, biological parent, once you make that determination, the other parent is 100% out of the equation. We would not need that other parent that we're not using for the FAFSA to be anywhere on the FAFSA. None of their income will get reported. And they would not need an FSA ID. But again, that second tier question that we talked about, it's super important. Once we determine which biological parent we're going with, we need to ask, are they married? Because if they are remarried to someone else, that's the other person who would potentially need an FSA ID. And even if they don't need an FSA ID because they filed jointly, they'll still need their income and demographic information in order to make this complete. Rita asks, is it possible that the parent which earns the most is not the one who provides the most financial support? Absolutely. So it is very, very important that we don't mistake in financial support for who made the most money or even who claimed who on taxes. It's simply who has provided the most financial support to that particular student over the last year. So that could be a situation that changes. That's a fluid situation, but absolutely there could be some situations where it could be a parent who makes less. And the other thing that's going to take us some getting used to, it could be the parent that the kid doesn't live with, theoretically. So these are going to be some things to certainly sort through with our families. Jennifer asks, for students that get benefits through their parents' military status, like a disabled veteran, would you use that parent in cases of divorce? So for the FAFSA itself, you would go just simply with who has provided the most financial support. But I will say, in terms of VA benefits, you would certainly want, my advice would be to reach out to a VA field rep. There's a field benefit staff throughout the state of Kentucky. If you Google VA field rep, no matter which county you live in, you can kind of see who that person is who can actually look up and see which benefits might be eligible for the student based on their parents' status. So they're kind of like outreach counselors just from the VA side, but that would be my recommendation for any family that may be sorting through some of those benefits. Great questions, guys. Again, feel free to type away if you have any questions or if I say anything that doesn't make sense. So we talked about students who live in two-parent homes are going to be in some cases where both parents are going to need to log in separately and confirm their information separately with their own FSA ID. Again, how many tax records are we pulling from? That's how many accounts we're going to need. I will say this, guys.
And like I said, the pom-pom thing got soft.
Don't mind to mute yourself. There we go. All right. So when we're talking about situations where, where I'm more concerned about these changes, I'll tell you that the segment of the population that worries me are the current college students. To be honest, a high school senior, I think we need to be careful with the high school population of not making all these changes to be like on the forefront of their mind. To them, it's just a FAFSA. It's not a changed FAFSA or a new FAFSA or anything like that. It's just a FAFSA to them. So if I were you, if you work with high school students, I would not be talking about all these changes, because a lot of it is it's just going to confuse them and make them feel more anxious than what they may already feel. But the population that I'm most concerned about are the current college students, because they actually do have something to compare this FAFSA to. They're going to notice the changes, because there could be situations when it comes to parent information that a current college student, they might have to use a different parent than what they have in the past. Because again, the old rule was, which parent did you live with more? Now it's which parent has provided the most financial support. That may not always be the same person. So what I would do if any of you work with college students would be really, really focus on some messaging over the next month or so to really get the word out about some of these changes. To help you all on KY Goes to College, if you click on kygoestocollege.com, at the top of our homepage, you'll see a link that says Better FAFSA Training Center. If you click on that, guys, we have all kinds of resources for both high school students as well as college students, and they're different. We decided to split up the resources so that we could really kind of target language differently for the high school crowd versus someone who would be at the college level. So I would encourage you to check that out. That'll help guide your students through some of these changes. Another thing that is problematic for current college students is that the renewal is not going to be an option for this cycle. So I know, folks who have done the FAFSA before, they really like that renewal because it saves most of their situation or most of their information from last year's FAFSA. They're just updating income and tax stuff and they're good to go, and it takes just a few minutes. That's not going to be an option because the form is so different. It's a different calculation, different form, the whole 9 yards. I will say that's only going to impact this year. Once we get past this first cycle, we will have renewals as an option moving forward. One positive change I do want to share when it comes to parent information for any parents who have multiple kids that they need to help the FAFSA, help with the FAFSA with, they're going to have an easier way transferring data from several different FAFSAs. So because it's all tied in by demographic information instead of these like long linear forms, when a parent theoretically goes in and completes their FAFSA or their portion of the FAFSA, it'll know that based on that social and that date of birth and all of that stuff, that it needs to go to little Johnny's FAFSA over here and to Susie's FAFSA over here because of that demographic info. It's all tied in based on the student and parents' demographic information that they input into the form itself. So theoretically, if a parent has multiple FAFSAs to complete this stuff for, they should be able to just go ahead and do it one time, and it'll automatically transfer to each student that they need to be on. All right, let's switch gears and talk SAI for a minute. The Student Aid Index. As I mentioned, this is what replaces the EFC, the Expected Family Contribution. As we talked about during the KHEAA game, one of the biggest changes with this SAI frame of mind is that you can actually have a negative SAI number. In fact, it'll go as low as negative 1,500. Any non-tax filer, anyone who does not file taxes, will automatically be a negative 1,500 SAI. So what does that mean exactly? Well, to be honest, not a whole lot. If you have a negative 1,500 SAI, it is no different than having a zero SAI. It doesn't mean more Pell Grant will be awarded, but what it does allow is potential for more institutional aid. So colleges could look at those negative SAIs and potentially award based on that. So the best way I can describe this new SAI process is the reason why they go with this negative number potentially is to basically identify additional levels of need. So instead of having a lot of students fall into what used to be the zero EFC category, this breaks it down an extra step. So it gives tiers to need, and it allows colleges to identify students who have the highest levels of need. So again, if you have a negative 1,500 SAI or a zero SAI, it's going to be the same amount of Pell Grant that you get from that point, but it could potentially mean some other money coming from the college. Also worth noting about these negative SAI numbers, it still cannot exceed cost of attendance. So whatever the cost of attendance of the college is, that's still the ceiling of what we're looking at. That's still the cutoff when it comes to financial aid. Having that negative SAI doesn't give you more wiggle room for that type of stuff. It really just helps identify levels of need for colleges to be able to award certain aid programs that way. So just keep that in mind. Of all the areas of the FAFSA that have changed the most, I would say the asset questions are probably the most drastic changes in my opinion. Before I get into what has to now be reported as an asset, let me first talk about who doesn't have to worry about it. Because the good news is, guys, A sizable chunk of the population will never, ever, ever see a single asset question on the FAFSA. So let's talk about who doesn't have to worry about it. First off, anyone who's eligible for a maximum Pell Grant, such as a non-tax filer, not one single asset question will show up on their FAFSA. So they won't have to worry about it. Let's say they filed taxes, but they make less than $60,000 a year. So their adjusted gross income from their tax return is less than 60 grand, and they have no Schedule C, which is like business income. If that's the case, not going to have to worry about asset questions. Let's say they did file a Schedule C, so they had some business income, but it happened to be less than 10 grand. If that's the case, not going to have to worry about any asset questions. And then finally, it's going to have a laundry list of federal benefit programs that are means tested, like free or reduced lunch and Medicaid and certain other programs from the federal government. If they check any of the boxes to say that they're eligible for one of these programs, they're also going to be exempt from asset reporting. One thing that I do want to make clear, though, and I will say that this has been a point of contention, and not every organization agrees with this, but this is KHEAA's stance on it. When they're talking about federal benefit programs that are means tested, the one in particular that I think gets confusing for a lot of folks is free reduced lunch. Here's the thing. There are a lot of school districts I know in Kentucky have free reduced lunch across the board for anyone who goes to that particular school. In fact, for that matter, heck, there are certain states that have universal free reduced lunch. The state of California, no student at a public school in California pays for lunch. Here's the thing. What we feel, our understanding of this particular piece of that, when it says means tested federal benefit program, what we take that as meaning in our interpretation is that you individually would qualify for free reduced lunch. So if you go to a school that has free reduced lunch across the board, what really you need to be asking, does that particular student have the paperwork on file that shows that they're eligible for free reduced lunch? If not, I would not check that box. That, to be honest with you, that's how KEYS money works too. We have that AP bonus award through KEYS. It's also based on individually qualifying for free reduced lunch. It's not based on whether or not the school has the grant that gives free reduced lunch across the board. So just FYI, our interpretation of that is, do you individually qualify for free reduced lunch, regardless of whether or not the school receives a grant or if you live in a state that has universal free reduced lunch? It's simply, do you individually qualify? All right, so that's our 2 cents on that. If you are required to report assets, so let's say none of those situations that we just mentioned, apply to our family. So in other words, let's say we made more than $60,000 a year on our taxes, we are now going to be required to report assets. One of the biggest changes has to do with farms and businesses and how you report that. You now have to report the net worth of any farms, regardless of whether or not you live on that farm. That's a huge, huge change. And I know us living in Kentucky, a lot of rural families, a lot of rural communities that have a lot of farming families in them. That's going to be something that we're going to have some questions about, I'm sure, during FAFSA season. So just brace yourself. You now have to report the value of a farm, even if you live on it. Before, you only had to report that farm if it was like an investment farm down the road. But now, even if you live on that farm, it is considered an asset. The way you would report that, though, you would take out the primary residence out of the equation. So if you live on a farm, basically take out the house. All that surrounding property, that's what you would report as your net worth of the farm. The other thing that's worth noting about net worth, guys, when we're talking about reporting assets, I don't want families to over-report too much money on this stuff, because that's one of the most common mistakes on the FAFSA that I've seen over the years is they put too much money down. When we're talking about reporting assets, we're only looking at the net worth. I can tell you this, from my experience, there are a lot of farming families that have a lot of loans attached to their farms, to their properties. So remember, when we're talking about net worth, it's essentially the dollar amount that we put in is, if you're to sell that asset tomorrow, what would you walk away with? After the bank gets their cut, after everyone gets their cut, what do you actually walk away with? That's the net worth. So just keep that in mind, and certainly help us, push that messaging along. If you have a farming family who's stressed about this change, just make sure that they're aware that if you owe any money, take it out of the equation, whatever that dollar amount is. It's what would you simply walk away with, at an estimate of what you would walk away with if you sold it tomorrow. The other change that's going to be pretty difficult for folks is going to be business assets. It used to be, the old rule was, if you had fewer than 100 full-time employees, you didn't have to report any business as an asset if you had fewer than 100 full-time employees. But now, if you're required to report assets, it doesn't matter how many employees you have. If you own a business, you will have to report the net worth of that as an asset. So again, You could have 0 people working for you. If you own a business, you are going to have to report the net worth of that as an asset. Some good news in the asset section has to do with 529 plans. Those are those college savings accounts. So like the one that we have at KHEAA here in Kentucky is KY Saves. But one of the nice changes come down the pike has to do with those accounts. The old rule used to be if you were a parent, you owned a 529 account, you used to have to report the entire value of that account as an asset. Now you only have to count the portion of the pie that goes to that particular student. So if you're like me, I have 2 little girls. So theoretically, my 529 plan that I have is cut 50-50. So when I fill out the FAFSA for my oldest daughter, Harper, I'm only going to have to provide 50% of that account. So you only have to provide the portion that's going to that particular student. And I'm also going to let you all know about a little bit of a loophole with these changes to the asset section as well. If, let's say, grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, anyone, because anyone can technically set up one of these accounts for anyone else. You don't necessarily have to even be related, but just know if anyone were to set up a 529 plan who is not a biological parent and who is not a student, nowhere on the FAFSA does that get reported. So a little bit of a loophole. So if grandma or grandpa sets up a 529 plan for a student, it's not going to get counted anywhere on the FAFSA. The old FAFSA used to have a question about money received or bills paid on your behalf and that sort of thing. That's where it would get hit. That doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, the untaxed income section doesn't exist anywhere on the FAFSA moving forward. And because of that, it does create a little bit of a loophole. Again, if grandma or grandpa sets one of these 529 plans up, it would not get reported as an asset for the student or the parents moving forward on the FAFSA. So let's just say I know what I'm asking my mother-in-law for Christmas this year for my kids. So FYI. As I mentioned, the untaxed income section is no more. The one thing that survived that cut is child support received. That used to be where that was. Now child support received is going to be in the asset section. But the way that that's going to get reported is you would only report what you actually received over the last full calendar year. So if you fill out this FAFSA in January of 2024, as weird as it sounds, you would actually be reporting 2023 value of child support received. Pretty much everything else is going to be 2022 income that's getting reported, but that child support received, the way it's worded, is the last full calendar year. Couple things worth noting. When we say what child support was received, remember, it's not necessarily what was agreed upon or what the court said that a parent was supposed to pay. It was what did you actually receive. So just FYI as you help families through that. All right, let me check the questions really quick. All right, what if the parents are divorced and parent A is living together with someone that makes $250,000, provides the most, but they're not married versus parent B that does pay child support? Does parent A need to be married for their $250,000 to count? Yes. To answer your question, Larry, you would only, so like you would never put someone's income other than either a parent or a step parent on the FAFSA. So if they're not married, you would not have to include the $250,000 income. But if they are married and they live together, that would be a part of that equation. But remember, that fork in the road for divorce situations is which biological parent, not necessarily which household, but which biological parent has provided the most financial support. And then finally, Rita asks, is it possible for a non-tax filer to be the parent who provides the most financial support? It could be theoretically. It would be difficult to prove that, but just know that, yes, theoretically, the parent who is a non-tax filer could technically still be the one who provides the most financial support. And then Rita asks, does the 529 have to be in the student's name in order for it to be considered an asset? No, if it's in a biological parent, if it's in the biological parent's name as the owner, that would also be as an asset. But if it's anyone other than the parent or the student themselves, that's what I was saying is a little bit of a loophole. So if a grandparent were to open up one in their name and have the kid be the beneficiary, that would be an example of something that would not be actually included on the FAFSA. Great questions, guys. All right, let's switch gears to Pell eligibility. When we're talking about Pell Grants, as I mentioned earlier, they are projecting that 2/3 of all applicants on the FAFSA now will be eligible for a Pell Grant. That's crazy. In a normal year, it's usually 35 to 40%. tops, but now they're projecting 66% of applicants will be eligible for a Pell Grant. Of those 2/3 of applicants, they are projecting that 40% will be eligible for the maximum Pell Grant, which right now stands at $7,395. There is a little bit of movement at the federal level that could be increased a little bit between now and next school year, but we don't know that for sure. So as it stands right now, currently the maximum Pell Grant amount is $7,395. Remember, that's the max. That doesn't mean everyone who gets a Pell Grant will get that dollar amount. It is a sliding scale based on need. But one of the major changes to the calculation itself for Pell eligibility is now it's determined by family size, adjusted gross income, and here's the new part, 2022 federal poverty charts, or the SAI, whichever is most favorable for the student. So the old way of doing the FAFSA is it was just basically all pulled in from that EFC code. Now it basically, you look at the poverty charts. The financial aid office looks at the poverty charts from 2022. They compare it to the SAI, whichever ends up getting that student in a better situation or more money, that's what we go with. So if anyone wants a sneak peek of eligibility, go ahead and Google the 2022 federal poverty charts and kind of compare like household size to certain incomes. And that'll give you a general understanding of where we're talking in terms of those poverty charts. We have another question that has come through. If a graduating senior does not live with either parent and either parent contributes to their expenses, do they still need to get their parents' information for the FAFSA? They would theoretically. So Cindy, to answer your question, in that student personal circumstances section, where it used to be called the dependency section, there will be a series of scenarios where if they can check a box at any of them, doesn't matter how many, but if they can say yes to any of the scenarios listed in that section, they're going to be considered independent for financial aid purposes, and they would not need a parent to go on their FAFSA. But if they cannot say yes to any of the situations listed in that section, then they would still theoretically need their biological parent to go on the FAFSA with them, even if they don't live with them, even if that parent does not contribute at all financially to them. I know that sounds a little strange, but that is how that process works. But I will say this: if you're helping a student that's in a similar situation, I always ask them, how easy or difficult would it be to get biological parent information? Because if there's an extenuating circumstance as to why you would not be able to get parent information, and what I mean by that is either A, it's unsafe to get parent information, or B, maybe the whereabouts are unknown of the parents. We don't know where they are. If any of those situations apply, then what my recommendation would be is to reach out to the financial aid office and discuss what they call dependency override appeal, just to see if that might be an option to consider. But again, those are usually reserved for extenuating circumstances where it's unsafe to get parent information or we do not know where they are. Great question. All right, so let's talk a little bit about logistics, guys, in the process. I can't stress enough what we were saying at the beginning about creating these FSCIDs early. If we can get these put to bed between now and winter break, that's going to make everyone's life easier who deals with the FAFSA, because we're not going to have to wait for that verification to come through. We're going to be able to immediately jump into the FAFSA, provide that consent, and get these FAFSAs taken care of into the finish line very quickly. So I would be really campaigning to get all of your students set up with FSCIDs and do your best to try to get that messaging out with parents as well, because remember, not just the students are going to need FSCIDs, but parents also. And there are going to be a lot of households where two parents are going to need their own separate FSCID and not just one. Okay. As we keep mentioning, now the way that we're doing these FAFSAs, the student's going to complete their portion, the parent's going to complete theirs based on that demographic information. When the student and or the parent puts in their social and date of birth and the whole 9 yards, that's what ties it all together. So because of that, the last contributor to a family who goes in and completes their portion, that's the person who's actually going to hit submit to be able to put it to the finish line, to be able to submit and process that FAFSA. So if you're helping a student and they're the first one in their family to get started on their portion, and you're wondering, where's that button at? I don't see a button to hit submit. That's why, is because they've been deemed to be dependent and they're waiting on those other contributors to go on to the FAFSA, complete their portion before that student's able to submit. I think that's actually a good change. I don't know, if you all have noticed over the years, there have been a lot of students who have submitted FAFSAs incomplete, where they thought they were good to go, but it turns out they were missing parent information or something was hanging out there. That should be alleviated quite a bit, because it's not even going to pop up with a button or an option to hit submit until everyone who's supposed to be on the FAFSA has had a chance to go in there and complete their portion. So just FYI. The other thing that I want to talk about logistically, as we talked about, the student will invite the parent or the parent can invite the student. Either one, doesn't matter who starts it or who finishes it, but you don't necessarily have to wait for that invite email. The reason why I'm just putting that in your head now is because I just know how these things work. In a perfect world, that email will come through like instantaneously. We all know how that can sometimes work with those codes, with the FSA IDs and so on and so forth. So just know if the parent logs on to their email and they're not seeing this invite link coming through, first I would check their spam folder, see if it's in there. But if it's not, just know you don't necessarily have to wait for that. If the parent has an FSA ID, you can have them just go ahead and log on to studentaid.gov with that FSA ID. When they type that stuff in, it's still going to get them connected to the right FAFSA. So just know you don't have to necessarily wait for that invite email to come through. Okay, so keep that in mind. Rita asks, parents that file separately and one parent is a non-tax filer, will both parents still need to create a FAFSA ID, particularly the non-tax filer? The answer is yes to that. So if they are not joint tax filers, then both are going to need an FSA ID. And even if let's say no one filed taxes, if both parents are non-tax filers and the student's a non-tax filer, they would still all need their own FSA ID. And as strange as it may sound, they all also need to provide that consent to the IRS to pull tax records. And again, in that situation, if they didn't file taxes, what the IRS is pulling is a record that says we have no record of taxes.
Yeah.
If y'all don't mind to go ahead and mute yourselves. Thank you. All right. So when we're talking about the calculation, one thing that's going to be really, really tough for current college students has to do with the elimination of what we used to call the student sibling discount. It used to be, the old FAFSA was, if you had more than one kid in college at the same time, say you had two kids in college, that old EFC used to get cut in half for that. And that helped a lot of families get into Pell Grant territory if you had multiple kids in college. Unfortunately, guys, that's going away. Nowhere does this SAI get cut in half based on the number of kids who are in college. So because of that, they are projecting that 13% of returning college students who have received a FAFSA in the past may lose their Pell eligibility, or I'm sorry, receive the Pell Grant in the past, may lose their eligibility with this change. Here's the thing though, here's the silver lining that I keep referring to. If you're in a situation where you're helping a college student and they used to get the Pell Grant, but because of this sibling discount going away, they no longer get that Pell Grant, the feds have given wiggle room to colleges across the country to be able to do professional judgment appeals based on this new calculation of the FAFSA. So if you run into a situation where a student has lost their Pell Grant, our advice is to have them talk to their financial aid office about their situation, because there's a good chance that financial aid office will be able to work something out with them. Okay, so just keep that in mind. It would be a professional judgment appeal. The guidance that we've seen at the federal level for those of you who work on the college side is that you could potentially treat college tuition similar to how you could do an appeal based on like private K through 12 tuition. Some colleges have shared that they're thinking about maybe even tweaking the AGI. So there's a couple different ways of looking at that, but just know if someone who has received the Pell Grant in the past and they no longer do because of this change, they do have the ability to talk through that with a financial aid office and potentially get a professional judgment through. You may be wondering, a lot of these changes seem to be, negative in terms of the assets that now have to get reported and the sibling discount going away. How are so many more people eligible for more Pell Grant money? Here's why. There's a significant increase in what they call the income protection allowance. So the way that all this stuff works and plays out behind the scenes, all this stuff that gets reported in terms of income and assets and stuff, only a sliver actually goes into the calculation itself and the finished product when it comes to determining eligibility for things. So a larger chunk is getting shielded and protected through this income protection allowance. That's the biggest reason why more people than ever before are going to be eligible for a Pell Grant. Remember what we said in the Kahoot game? They are projecting that 500,000 more people than before will be eligible for a Pell Grant. There'll be three ways of getting a Pell Grant. They'll have this minimum Pell Grant amount, that max Pell, which we talked about was $7,395. And then there will be some circumstances where they'll fall somewhere in between, and that's what they'll call a calculated Pell. All that means is that the financial aid office will be calculating that based on their SAI. Okay, so that'll help determine how much Pell Grant a student might receive. But again, at the end of the day, it's all based on what's most favorable for the student. There's no early estimates on verification rates, but we do imagine that there could be fewer verification situations being selected on this new FAFSA, because theoretically it should be very rare that we're manually inputting tax information. Most of this is going to be automated through that direct data exchange, so that should cut down on the number of verifications that students will see. Another thing that's worth noting, if a FAFSA language preference is set to Spanish, the invite email to the parent will also be in that particular language as well. So I say Spanish as an example, but just so everyone's aware, Federal Student Aid has announced that they're going to have the FAFSA in the top 8 most widely spoken languages in the U.S. So the top 8. And if a family speaks something that's not in the top 8 languages in the U.S., there's going to be a number they can call to get some translation help as well. So those are some positive changes to the FAFSA that should make it a little bit more accessible to more folks. We talked about the 45-day period. When it comes to undocumented parents, y'all remember what we said at the beginning. Undocumented parents are now required to have an FSA ID. Here's the thing, guys. I think it's super important for all of us on this call who help families and parents through this process. I think we need to be mindful of what we're asking an undocumented parent to do. It's a lot to ask of an undocumented parent to provide information on a federal government form. So we need to be very sensitive about that as we have those conversations. We've even asked the feds when we've been at different trainings, how do you have that conversation with a parent who may be anxious about the idea of providing this information, who happens to be undocumented? And the response that we received is that, first off, share that it is very secure and private, and that Federal Student Aid is only using that information for financial aid purposes and nothing else. Still think that's easier said than done, but I think it is worth noting that that's something we need to be sensitive about as we have those conversations with families, and just know that we are asking a lot when we're asking someone to create an FSA ID who may be undocumented. So just be aware of that as you talk with students and families. Victims of identity theft will be able to manually enter their tax information. So that would be one of the exceptions to the rule, where they're not going to be able to pull that info from the IRS. They'll have to kind of go old school and go line by line through their tax information. Anyone who goes that manual process is probably going to have some follow-up with the financial aid office. So just kind of gear them up for that and make sure that they're prepared. When we're talking about FSA ID workshops and setting these things up, one thing in particular, just a couple tidbits, practical piece of advice for those of you who are thinking about planning these in your schools or your communities. Just know, I know at the high school level, there are a lot of high schools that have blocks on Gmail and Yahoo and like these other types of email accounts. So we'll have to think about that. So I know some counselors have reached out to us about even potentially partnering with like a library or, a cooperative extension office or some other partner throughout the community that may not have as many restrictions on email accounts and Wi-Fi and stuff like that. So those are some things to think about. Also, as you help students set up their FSA ID accounts, I can't stress enough the importance of not using their school district email. This FSA ID is theoretically going to stay with them throughout college and beyond. So, for those of you who are aware, very shortly after graduation, those school emails go away. So I would encourage them to set up their own Gmail account if they don't have that. So these are some things that I would certainly recommend thinking about ahead of time before putting together an FSA ID or a FAFSA workshop at your school. Another thing to keep in mind is, again, going back to that messaging piece, we have on KYGoesToCollege.com, if you hit Better FAFSA Training Center, we have messaging specifically for high school students, and we also have a FAFSA completion guide for current college students. So I would definitely be just mindful of who your audience is as you spread the word about these changes. Again, if it's a high school senior, there's no sense in getting them worked up about all these changes, because in their mind, it's just a FAFSA. It's not anything new. They don't have anything to compare to. Whereas the college students, I do think, need to know a little bit more about these changes that are coming down the pike. And then finally, I know a lot of you use our completion reports from KHEAA, our FAFSA completion reports that show those weekly printouts of all the students in your schools who have completed the FAFSA. And they used to also show incomplete FAFSAs. I will say this, moving forward with this new FAFSA, the way that it is, we will not be able to show incomplete FAFSAs on those reports. We're going to have to go just kind of work backwards. We'll be able to still show anyone who is complete on their FAFSA, but we'll just have to work back from that on a weekly basis when those completion reports are being sent out from KHEAA. So just FYI. Let's check the chat box real quick. One question is, do you know what 8 languages will be covered? I know Spanish is one of them. Yes, Spanish is definitely one of them. I don't have those memorized, unfortunately, off the top of my head. But again, if someone is speaking something other than those top 8 languages, they will have a number that they can call to get translation help that'll be more expansive than the 8. And then, can their email be changed if they use the school email when they set it up? Yes, and that's actually a really good question. When it comes to changing email address, you can always log on to an FSAID and update that information. So if you have parents who have set up an FSAID in the past, or maybe current college students who have set up an FSAID in the past, I think it would be a really good idea to have them log on and just check and make sure they have an up-to-date current phone number attached to it, an up-to-date current email address as well. And if not, I would certainly have them go in and change that. So you can certainly change that information on your FSAID account. And you don't have to wait for the FAFSA to do that either. Anyone can go on to studentaid.gov, log in with what they have, and they can edit their information. Great questions, guys. We have a couple more regional trainings coming up. If anyone is interested in going to an in-person training provided by KHEAA, again, we are updating this on a weekly basis, this presentation. This is how everything we know at this particular moment. But again, we might learn something in the next week or so that changes some of this stuff. That certainly has happened a few times throughout the fall. But if you want to check out, we have an RSVPify link here that shows some of our regional trainings that are coming up in the next couple of weeks. We only have a couple more left, but we do have a couple the first week or so in December. If you'd like to check any of those out, they're all free, but space is limited. So if you would like to sign up for one, we'd love to see you. And then finally, just a quick favor to ask of everyone, if you don't mind, I would certainly appreciate it if you could complete this brief survey for us, just to let us know how we did. Again, if there's ever anything we can do to help you and your students or anyone in your community with college access or FAFSA completion, please feel free to reach out to us at any point. You have a team of outreach counselors available. Myself, I'm always available. My director, Cassie Benedict, is great to work with as well. So if you all ever need anything from us, please feel free to reach out. But if you don't mind to take a minute to complete that survey while we're all here, I would certainly appreciate that. Thank you, Rita, for the kind words. And then Jennifer asked, will the recording and PowerPoints be available to those of us who attended? Yes, Jennifer, my plan is to get this on our YouTube channel tomorrow. So this is being recorded and we'll get that out. And that way, if you all want to reference this in the future, you certainly can. I do not actually have a link for the survey. No worries if the QR code is giving your phone any problems. I know my phone can be finicky with those things as well. So I feel your pain. I appreciate it, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out today. Again, my name's Keith Ritchie. If you ever need anything from me, please feel free to email me. My email is rkritchie, and that's RITCHIE. There's a million ways to spell that one. RK Ritchie, RITCHIE. I'll put that in the chat box. Please feel free to reach out at any point. I'd be happy to help. But we can. Thank you all so much for coming out today. Safe travels if any of you all are driving anywhere today, but thank you all so much. We'll catch you in FAFSA season.